Welcome everyone to the Disruptive Jam. My name is Carrie Forbes and I am your resident DJ, that's Disruptive Jammer, and really happy to have you join me on this podcast. It's a place where we get to talk about all of the things that surprise us, that throw us off, but also become our opportunities. So let's get started. Welcome, everyone. I have with me as my special guest today, Ellie Duncan, and she's joining me actually all the way from the UK. I would like to mention this book that we're going to talk a little bit today. This is Ellie's book, Open Banking and Financial Inclusion, because today's episode is all about inclusion revolution, and we're going to go through picking Ellie's brain a little bit to find out what that means. But first, let me give you a little bit of her bio. She is a financial journalist and head content at Open Banking Expo. She hosts the Open Banking Expo Unplugged podcast and appears on Open Banking Expo TV. She is an experienced broadcast journalist who has moderated webcasts for a number of FT titles, including Fundfire and Ignites US. So Ellie, I've said enough, but maybe for our listeners, before we jump into a lot of the book and that, I'd like to kind of just get them to know you a little bit. So tell us a little bit about maybe a little bit of your journey to the journalist you are today.
Yeah, of course. Well, thank you so much, Carrie, for having me on your podcast. And I love the inclusion theme. Can't wait to kind of get stuck into that a little bit more. But yeah, my journey into journalism started nearly 20 years ago now, maybe sort of 18 years ago. And I'd always wanted to be a journalist. I have to say, I didn't always want to be a financial journalist. That bit was a little bit surprising to find myself writing about financial services. But I've met a lot of financial journalists who always say the kind of same thing, that you fall into financial journalism a bit. And then once you're in it, you realize it's kind of a fascinating world, and you don't really want to leave it. So my very first job in journalism was sort of writing for a business title about SME funding for UK SMEs. And I kind of moved on to writing about investment, asset management, and that involved a little bit about economics as well. And yeah, I did end up working at the Financial Times Group for about 5 years. So they've got a portfolio of specialist titles, and I worked across a couple of those. And it was as I worked across those that I kind of found my feet a little bit more. You know, I kind of specialized in longer form content, so features writing as opposed to news writing. And I also began to experiment and play around a bit with video and podcast as well. So kind of helped to launch a podcast series for one of the titles there. And got some training while I was at the FT Group in their kind of amazing studios that overlooked the Thames. I got some video training as well. So that once I kind of honed those skills a bit and realized, you know, that I had a real interest in the kind of broadcast side as well, then I began to take on a few more public speaking roles, you know, moderating, I suppose, webinars, panel debates, that kind of thing, especially when we were in the midst of the pandemic and there was endless online webinars and so on. So I did a number of those, including for Open Banking Expo, actually. And it was while I was doing some work for them for a few days a week that I began to learn about this thing called open banking and the world of FinTech. And it was also new, you know, it still is. It's a very nascent industry, but compared to, you know, considering I've been writing about sort of asset management, which is many decades or hundreds of years old, if you like, you know, those kind of traditional financial services, this felt like a kind of breath of fresh air and something that was fascinating, but I couldn't say for sure that I knew or understood how all the tech worked, because there was a lot of tech involved. Tech is not my speciality. So yeah, but nevertheless, I wasn't going to be deterred by that. And I thought, well, you know, I've learned a lot. I've been able to pick up a lot about different about, you know, the different aspects of the financial industry over the years. So I'm sure I can get my head around this one. And then, yeah, made the move to Open Banking Expo just over 2 years ago now, just to work for them full time and really head up their content, as you mentioned, their podcast, and also, yeah, took on a few more roles in terms of speaking at events and conferences in the space as well, including at Open Banking Expo Canada, of course, which is how we came to meet, isn't it?
It absolutely is. And I love the journey that you've taken me through, because there's a lot here that I reflect on about people who are not necessarily the typical fit in a particular industry. And that in itself is pretty disruptive when you look at it. So when I think about this, you're a writer. And you come from, and it's funny, I had a background in writing before I got into the financial world as well, which is so fascinating.
Yeah.
There ended up being a lot of artists sometimes, or people with creativity or with that side, that end up in these spaces. So tell me a bit about what it's like being a writer in a world of engineers and bankers. And how do you think maybe what you bring to the table, how does that add to the story?
So I think you come at it from a slightly different perspective personally. So I studied English literature at university, and then I went straight into working in kind of journalism. And so I think that gave me just this kind of drive to kind of unpick things. So I think you already come with the skill to want to know more, learn more. And that is something you do really need when you're faced with quite kind of technical industries, and especially in open banking, really is all about a kind of a tech stack that sits behind this kind of concept. But I think also as a creative kind of person, you come with an interest in people. So that's the angle that I often try to bring is, okay, there's this bit of technology here, seems a bit intangible to me. What's the kind of more tangible aspect that I can then draw out into whatever it is, whether it's a news story, a feature, or a podcast episode? So I like to think that, being a creative person and having studied, literally just studied literature, so looking at characters, and you want to know more about people, and you want to understand how people's lives are affected by this new technology or a financial service. And so I think that's the kind of lens that I bring to it.
So I'd say that's probably how you found this open banking place to be so intriguing, because it really is at the surface. It's like when you use the word open banking, you just think about the typical industry and, money and all of those things. But maybe you can tell us from your background, especially being in the UK and the epicenter of where open banking really has taken, I'd say, its roots. What if you were to tell our listeners, what does that really mean for the average person per se?
Yeah, okay, that's a good question. I think if you were to go now to the average person in the UK and try and start a conversation about open banking, you'd probably get given the cold shoulder, or they just wouldn't have any idea what you were talking about. So we are talking about something that is changing people's lives and they don't realize it. That's kind of part of the beauty of open banking. And I think when, a lot of times individuals, consumers use financial services and they're probably not fully aware of what they're using. And that's fine. We're never going to know everything or understand everything about this, because people don't work in this industry day in, day out. They just need the service or the product to work for them at that point in time, safely and securely, and maybe even deliver above their expectations if possible, And I think in the UK, we've been able to, because we've taken this, I guess took a kind of lead, in open banking. So it's kind of now 7 years old in the UK as of 13th of January. So we're a few years into it. And I think what that's meant is that there has been some genuinely kind of useful use cases, as we like to call them in open banking, that are starting to change people's lives. Now, whether they're sort of aware of it as such, perhaps not. I think where people might have kind of come face to face with open banking a bit more is in something like trying to access credit, particularly if they have, say, no credit history, or they're what we call sort of credit invisible, they have a very low credit score, any of those kind of things. That's where I think open banking really has the potential to change people's lives and to be recognized as this kind of disruptive force in banking, which, is a really traditional sector. And I think now people are aware that, we create a lot of data. And a lot of the time for people, it feels like that's out of our control. Like we're the ones we're not actually benefiting from that. Other companies are benefiting from it. Corporates, they've got all this data on us, they're using it, they're profiting, from it. What's it got to do with us? And actually open banking is an example of something where we get to use our data. It's entirely consent driven, it's consumer permission data sharing. So it does mean, I think, for the first time that individuals are starting to see that actually this is all about them. It gives them control, and that they can really see the difference. And not just consumers, of course, but, small and medium businesses as well, that they're seeing open banking, a little bit more in terms of be able to get paid more quickly and easily and on time. So it's kind of helping that age-old late payments problem that we have, and also for them to get kind of access to the financing they need a little bit quicker or more smoothly, and so on. So it's a bit of a slow burn, though. I think something like open banking is, when you're talking about the UK, we are a developed country, so a lot of people are not financially excluded. They are not unbanked. Some people are, of course, but most of the population is banked. So, I think open banking can take a bit more time to kind of work through the system and for people to really feel the advantages of it, I suppose, and the benefits.
That's such a great way to, I think, help people understand that at the end of this. And for listeners here in Canada, we've been talking about this as long as the UK has been in the market with open banking solutions. But most people, like you said, really don't have a good handle on why that matters to them, except for maybe some accounting people or, like you say, for some data nerds who want to do things faster. But there is a human element to, first of all, I like what you said. There's consent, which is I get to decide where I share that data, but also about the power of access to, and I'll just sort of want to hone in on a term there called the unbanked. And for those who may not be familiar, in many places around the world, and also even in developed countries, and we have some of those in Canada, there are people without banking services at all. And that struggle to access even types of credit, even for things like renting, for example. So let's get into a little bit more of that when we think about your book and inclusion. So what inspired you to write about this and put it into, I guess, a journalist's view?
Yeah, I think it was that once I began to get my head around open banking, what it was, kind of how it worked on a basic enough level, enough that I could write day to day about what was going on in the world of open banking, I obviously began to appreciate a bit more actually just how disruptive a force this could be, and kind of wanted to explore that much further. I think I alluded earlier to the fact that I've tended to prefer kind of longer form content. And obviously a book is kind of
as long as it gets.
As long as it gets, yeah. And I've been approached by my publisher, who I ended up publishing this book with, to write about something. And they said, what would you want to write about? And I think this had obviously been sitting in my mind for a while, because I do care that people aren't part of a financial system. And I think that's something that stemmed back to when I'd written about investment and asset management. There are people who have, a decent amount of wealth going up to vast sums of wealth. And a lot of those people are extremely well served by financial services. The more wealth you have, the easier it is to accumulate more wealth. And that leaves a lot of people outside this financial system, which obviously has, some huge repercussions for them. As you pointed out, it can make it hard for them just to rent somewhere to live, let alone even buy somewhere. That's not even kind of within the realms of possibility, but even be able to rent somewhere, it can mean that it can leave people very vulnerable, of course. And it just means they don't have very much financial resilience. So if there's kind of financial shock in their life or some kind of life event, are kind of not well prepared for it. And it really matters to me, I think, that people are still excluded from financial services in this day and age. Like, that's something that, when we think about it, shouldn't really be allowed to happen. Now, obviously, there are, some people that want to sit outside the financial system, for various reasons, political, or because they would rather just handle cash, for example. But the truth is that we are moving to a digital, or we have really already moved to digital banking and digital financial services. And unfortunately, that means that a lot of people will be left behind. And I think the onus is on the industry, really, to make sure that people aren't left behind, that they are given that chance to, it's not always just about people having a chance to accumulate huge amounts of wealth. It's actually just being able to afford a decent standard of living, and the kind of access to credit, and to be able to afford somewhere to live. So yeah, those are the things, when I thought about it, as I'd been writing and learning about open banking, that kind of was the bit that ignited my passion and interest, really, and is what I thought, actually, there's a lot to explore here. Let's turn it into a book.
There definitely is. And as you're speaking about, I would say, the different impacts, I think that's also really interesting for folks to know that different countries have approached how they might adopt open banking for different reasons. And I think about India as an example. They went out with the intention of addressing their underbanked as a society. So I'm curious, is there a particular story or even an interview that stands out in particular that really talks about that impact and how open banking might help, or how it is helping?
Yeah, I mean, in my book, I do look at India a little bit, and because the kind of what they've been able to do in India, considering, it's a hugely populous country, and as you mentioned there, a lot of it was underserved or completely unbanked. And actually, interestingly enough, India made great advances during the pandemic. So, and that's not just true of India, it's actually true of quite a few other countries that I came across as I was writing. So Brazil would be sort of another one where we suddenly couldn't do anything in person, as we all recall. And people definitely didn't want to handle cash suddenly. And obviously, a lot of people couldn't or weren't allowed to leave their homes. So everything was online. And so that kind of digital inclusion piece really came to the fore. And countries like India really kind of exploited that in a way. They made the most of it because, as we remember, most countries, or a lot of countries, there were government handouts to people, whether that was because they were furloughed for work or whatever it was. And in places like India, and they were able to set up accounts, give everyone this account that these kind of welfare payments or state payments could be transferred into. And often for the first time, it was women that were receiving this payment. So in a lot of countries around the world, women don't have an account in their name, or any assets in their name. And actually, this was a way of actually giving women an online account, transferring money directly into it, and then they had the ability to either draw it down or to pay for whatever it was, household bills or food or whatever, from this account. And so in somewhere like India, that had kind of a huge impact. Suddenly people that hadn't been banked were, and then it was a case of getting them to kind of stay banked, so not just withdrawing money into cash and spending that, but actually to, okay, well, now you know how to do this, it kind of opens up all of these other opportunities. So I found that fascinating as I was writing my book. But it was interesting, a couple of the interviews that stood out were actually with people who were in kind of more developed economies, really. So one was with a woman who was a first generation immigrant. So she lived in America, but her parents were Indian, and she'd seen sort of firsthand, I guess, what a lack of financial education and also ownership had done to her own mother. So this woman, Vrinda Gupta, had founded this a startup called Sequin card in the US to help women to actually have an account in their name, to get financial education alongside that account that they had opened, and then kind of build their credit from there. give them confidence, essentially, in an area where I know a lot of people don't have confidence when it comes to their finances, but especially women, for the reasons I've said. Really, a lot of them they haven't had an account in their name, or they haven't had assets in their name. And if you don't have those things, you haven't built up a credit history, and that means that you're really just sitting outside of this system, looking into it, thinking, well, where did I go wrong, and how do I get into it? And so, yeah, speaking to Vrinda Gupta at the time was fascinating, because, yeah, she'd realised that actually she'd worked for a while herself in financial services and helped to design a card when she was working for a large financial institution, and then realised she couldn't even qualify to get one of these cards herself. Wow. And yeah, and so that's what spurred her on to start her own company, specifically aimed at women, really, and helping them to build credit. And I think it's those kind of stories that are really inspiring, because there are a lot of people who experience these sorts of setbacks and then go on to say, right, how can I solve this, not just for myself but for other people as well, which I found really, really interesting, actually.
And I think it really it goes back to when we think about revolution, that word revolution, it often comes from that place of need, a place where, okay, what the status quo is no longer here or acceptable, or we have to move forward. And what's interesting about both the examples of the individuals, or in the case of India in the pandemic, you have this situation where all of a sudden we need to react, we need to do something, and that can lead to different outcomes, but often it can lead to innovation. And that's the really interesting part, is how these people in these scenarios have been able to take advantage of the moment and then actually create something. So do you have an example or something that came across that was a really interesting innovation in your, throughout the process?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many innovations in kind of within open banking. I guess something that another story that I kind of highlighted in my book, another use case that really resonated was, and this is going back to this idea of there are lots of people who have a bank account, and so they feel like maybe they're in a good position, but actually they're potentially not, because if they looked, if they were to access their credit score, it wouldn't be good enough to actually get credit. So they couldn't get a loan or a mortgage or whatever it was. So actually they're sort of financially a little bit stuck. And that is especially the case as well if, you are an immigrant to a country, you aren't always able to bring your kind of credit history with you, which is an immense frustration for a lot of people. Like, I came across that a couple of times when I was writing my book. And one example in particular was this guy called Rob Pasco, who ended up founding an affordable loan provider in the UK called Plend. I believe he's actually left there since then, but the business is still going. And the idea is that, so he moved to the UK from New Zealand, I believe, and quickly realised that, his credit history didn't really come with him, but also he was just starting out, having graduated from university. He was trying to look for a job, and there were all these kind of barriers to that meant that very quickly and easily accumulated a bit of debt, because in order to rent a property here, he sort of had to prove his credentials, and then he had to come up with a deposit for a rental, and so on and so forth. And actually he realized that he'd managed to accumulate a lot of debt quite quickly, which then of course went against him on his credit file, and he just found the whole system so frustrating and so backwards, I suppose, that it really inspired him to establish this business called Plend, which helps specifically people who, as I say, might be credit invisible, helps them to access loans or whatever they need, but that is affordable. Because that's the other thing, there is often this trap that the people who can least afford to borrow end up having to borrow at extremely high rates, and and then they're just kind of just drowning, I suppose, in trying to get out of paying off this loan or whatever it is at a high interest rate. And so his story was really interesting, because I think often we can think of financial exclusion as being this thing that applies to these very, I don't know, just a certain type of person, or only applicable to certain people from certain countries, and actually, as I wrote my book, I realized that no, it's the case that this can happen to anyone, anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, that's the beauty of open banking, I suppose. Certain countries have obviously recognized, or many countries that have implemented open banking have recognized its potential to kind of solve for that financial exclusion piece, and bring more people into the system and make it kind of more equitable, I suppose.
So it's interesting to me, and as you're talking about these stories, I can see how they uplift you, right? They have this way of inspiring, and how you bring that story forward. I'm curious about how do you go through your creative process? So you're in this space, and you've got quite a lot of heavy material. It's technical, it's very in depth at times, but also it can be heavy as well with the content. And then thinking about how you bring that to your audience, how do you do that? Okay.
That's a really good question. And actually, when someone asks you what your creative process is, it's something I've been doing so long, it's hard to break it down. But to be fairly kind of, if I were to sum it up fairly concisely, I always think, who am I writing for? What's their knowledge base? And then even if I know that they're going to know something about open banking, I'm also going to take them back a few steps, maybe start with a few explanations, really bring everyone in on a level playing field who might read my book. Then I want to find the right people to speak to kind of bring something to life. And also, because I don't have all the answers and all the knowledge, and they're the ones that have the experience, or they might have implemented open banking somewhere, or as I say, they might be someone who's experienced financial exclusion themselves, and now they've done something to help overcome that for others as well as themselves. And so my process, I suppose, is all about each chapter, basically, for my book was sort of like this mini feature, a bit of an introduction. Why am I writing about this particular thing? What am I going to look at? Here's how I then cover it off. Pull out some stories, because we all need a story. We all need a narrative, because we want to buy into something, and we need to see how it plays out in real life. It needs to mean something to us, and we need to be invested in it. And then I would end each chapter with a kind of conclusion. So it would give me a chance to summarize, give me a chance to think, well, how does all this kind of come together, and what does it mean? And then doing that over sort of several, like 10 or so chapters, I ended up with a book. But in short, that's kind of how I think that's how I approach it. As I say, it's really difficult to break it down when it's sort of second nature, if you know what I mean. But it's
a lot like you're mixing a great record in many cases, as I said.
Yeah, I like that.
All right, I know we only have a couple minutes left, Ellie, but I'm just curious about 5 books that are on your mind.
Oh, yeah. So this is very hard. I'm an avid reader, and I'm trying to whittle it down to a mix of fiction and nonfiction. So I'll start with one nonfiction book, which I have here with me, actually. It's called The Skills by Michelle Hussein, who is an incredibly talented and experienced broadcast journalist here in the UK. So she's worked for the BBC, BBC Radio and News. And this book, The Skills, is from first job to dream job, what every woman needs to know. And she really does break it down. Actually, she writes, I think reading this book helped me to shape my own book. She really does break it down, and inspires you to have confidence as a woman in how you approach your job, and really holding your own space. So it's a great book. I can highly recommend it. A second nonfiction book is a book called Wintering by Catherine May. This is kind of going back to nature to make sure that our bodies and our minds are in rhythm with nature and the changing seasons. And she comes at it from someone who, when she started writing the book, was experiencing burnout and needed to kind of step back from it all and actually go through this period of wintering, so hibernating, and understanding kind of how you go back to nature, really, all of us, and why we need to do that. Another nonfiction book that I've read really recently that I loved was Inheritocracy by Dr. Eliza Philby, which is all about the bank of mum and dad, how they are helping the millennial generation to get on the property ladder, to afford childcare, and maybe how that's creating a bit of a generational divide for the haves and the have-nots, people that don't have access to the bank of mum and dad. What does it mean for them? And then I guess one of my favorite fiction books is Hamnet by Maggie O'Farrell. I absolutely love Maggie O'Farrell's work. Anything she writes is just magic, just really, really beautiful. And this is set so in Stratford upon Avon, where Shakespeare lived and where his family lived, and it is about his family. But it's really, really quite emotional, and yeah, I can highly recommend it. And then finally, have I already done 5? No, I've done 4, right? I think I can squeeze in a 5th.
Yeah, one more 5th.
Which is a book called Demon Copperhead by Barbara Kingsolver, and it's a play on David Copperfield by Charles Dickens. So all I can say is that it's a bit of an emotional rollercoaster of a ride. It involves the opioid crisis in the US. It is a huge book, and it's just wonderful.
We have cheers in the studio for that book. So
oh, did you? Yeah,
yes.
It's a popular one. I know it makes a lot of reading lists, but for very good reason, right?
Well, Ellie, I cannot thank you enough for being with us here today, talking all about your book and helping us understand the inclusion revolution. So thank you again, and I want to thank our listeners for tuning in to the Disruptive Journey. A lot of the conversation that we had with Ellie reminded me of something that we often overlook in the world of innovation, and that is the power of storytelling. Here I am, I'm sitting in a studio in Halifax, and I'm talking to this brilliant journalist in the UK about how we can make banking more human. And it's a great example of how technology isn't just about connecting bank accounts, it's connecting stories and narratives and shared experience. What fascinates me about Ellie's work is how she brings an artist's eye to an engineer's world. We explored how innovation spreads through trust networks and community connections. But Ellie showed something equally powerful, how the right story can turn complex technical changes into meaningful human progress. In my work with transformation, I often tell clients that change happens at the intersection of a strategy and a story. And I think Ellie's work and her book really embody this all perfectly well. But this is what modern leadership looks like: the ability to weave technical insight, human understanding, and find the story behind the statistics, and help others see what we're building in this future. So until next time, keep telling your story, keep pushing boundaries, and sometimes it's the most disruptive force isn't going to be the technologies and the new solutions that surround us, but the stories about what will be possible. Thank you for listening.